For centuries, chainmail was the armor of choice for knights across medieval Europe. Made of thousands of interlocking metal rings, it offered solid protection while allowing a surprising degree of flexibility and movement. On battlefields from the Crusades to the Hundred Years' War, it became a symbol of elite warrior status and battlefield endurance. But over time, things began to change. Weapons grew more powerful, tactics became more brutal, and the once reliable ringed armor started to show its limitations. Knights, known for their discipline and heavy gear, gradually moved away from chainmail, replacing it, adapting it, or leaving it behind entirely. In this video, we're going to explore exactly why that happened. How did the rise of blunt force weapons, long-range projectiles, and new military technologies push chainmail to the sidelines? And what replaced it when even the strongest links could no longer guarantee survival? Let's take a closer look at the battlefield realities that forced knights to rethink their armor, and why chainmail, despite its long legacy, couldn't keep up. Number 1. Chainmail wasn't always outdated. In the early Middle Ages, chainmail represented one of the most advanced and trusted forms of personal protection available to a soldier or knight. It was created through a labor-intensive process of linking thousands of small iron or steel rings together, forming a dense, flexible mesh that could be shaped into shirts, leggings, hoods, and mittens. When worn properly, this armor could cover nearly the entire body, offering consistent defense without restricting a knight's ability to ride, run, or fight on foot. One of the greatest advantages of chainmail was its balance between protection and freedom of movement, which was essential during long campaigns or when riding across varied terrain. Unlike rigid armor that could dig into the body or limit agility, chainmail moved with the wearer and allowed for a more natural combat stance. Its effectiveness was particularly evident against slashing attacks, which were common on medieval battlefields. Swords, axes, and other edged weapons would often glance off the interlinked rings rather than cutting through them, greatly reducing the risk of fatal wounds from glancing blows. Knights wearing chainmail could fight longer and take more hits without suffering serious injury from cuts. However, chainmail wasn't without weaknesses, and those started to become more apparent over time. While it could stop a sword swipe, it offered little resistance against heavy, blunt weapons that didn't need to cut, only to crush. Weapons like maces, flails, and warhammers were designed specifically to counter armor, and they could break bones or cause internal damage even if the chainmail itself wasn't penetrated. Additionally, as ranged weaponry became more powerful, chainmail's limitations became clearer. The development of the longbow, especially in England, introduced arrows capable of delivering tremendous kinetic force. These arrows could either burst open the links or drive through them entirely, particularly at close range or when shot at vulnerable angles. Crossbows, which required less training than longbows but were equally deadly, also began to pierce chainmail more reliably. These changes in weapon technology exposed the vulnerability of mail armor, especially as battles shifted to include more ranged engagements. Even by the 13th century, chainmail was still widely worn and respected, but it was no longer seen as invincible. Knights began to recognize that while it had served them well, the armor was gradually falling behind the evolving threats they faced on the battlefield. Number 2. Blunt weapons and arrows became deadlier. As warfare in the medieval period progressed, knights faced a growing challenge, not just from the increasing number of enemies on the battlefield, but from the evolving types of weapons being used against them. While chainmail had once been a reliable defense, especially against cutting attacks, it began to lose its effectiveness as the tools of war became more focused on crushing and penetrating, rather than slicing. The rise of blunt weapons played a significant role in this change. Weapons like warhammers, flanged maces, and morning stars were specifically designed to inflict damage through impact rather than sharpness. These weapons concentrated force into small areas, which allowed them to smash through armor or severely injure the wearer, even without breaking the surface of the mail. A knight wearing chainmail might feel confident when facing a sword, but a solid hit from a mace could result in broken ribs, damaged internal organs, or even a concussion through the helmet. Chainmail offered almost no absorption of force. It was essentially a layer of tough metal rings, not padding. If the blow didn't tear the armor, it could still transmit enough energy to cause real harm underneath. This shift in battlefield tactics forced knights to consider the limitations of their armor more seriously, especially when up against enemies equipped with heavy, crushing weapons. At the same time, the use of long-range weapons was becoming more common and more effective. Longbows, particularly in the hands of skilled archers, had the power to send arrows deep into a target even from considerable distances. These weren't casual weapons. They were capable of delivering massive kinetic force. A well-placed arrow could pierce chainmail, especially when aimed at thinner areas like the armpits, thighs, or neck. Even if the arrow failed to pass entirely through, it could become lodged in the rings, making movement more difficult and exposing the knight to further attacks. Crossbows were just as dangerous, if not more so. Unlike longbows, crossbows required less training and could still fire bolts with deadly power. They allowed infantry to threaten armored cavalry from behind defensive lines, something that earlier periods hadn't dealt with as seriously. The combined effect of these weapons, crushing from blunt force and piercing from high-powered arrows, meant that chainmail, once seen as a high-status form of defense, was no longer enough by itself. Knights began to realize that simply covering themselves in rings of steel wouldn't guarantee survival in the face of more specialized and powerful threats. The nature of battle had changed, and so too did the expectations for what armor needed to do. Number 3. Plate armor was the next step. By the end of the 13th century and into the early 14th, it became increasingly clear that the traditional reliance on chainmail was no longer enough to meet the challenges of the changing battlefield. Armorers and blacksmiths began developing more advanced forms of protection, focusing not just on resisting cuts but also on absorbing heavy impacts and blocking piercing strikes. This led to the introduction of rigid metal plates, which were first used to shield the most vulnerable parts of the body, such as the chest, shoulders, thighs, elbows, and knees. These were the areas most likely to be targeted in combat, and the ones where damage could disable a knight quickly. The early approach wasn't to replace mail entirely, but rather to reinforce it. Chainmail was still worn underneath, while steel plates were added on top, where extra strength was needed. This combination created a new style of armor known as transitional armor, which gradually moved toward full plate as technology and design improved. One of the earlier solutions was the coat of plates, a garment where small steel plates were riveted between layers of cloth or leather. It didn't offer complete coverage, but it was a significant step forward, especially in protecting the torso from crushing weapons and direct blows. Knights wearing this type of armor could survive hits that would have caused serious injuries through mail alone. As the designs became more sophisticated, larger and more articulated plates began to appear, shaped to follow the contours of the human body. The goal wasn't just protection, it was also mobility. By the 15th century, full suits of plate armor had become a reality for knights who could afford them. These suits included jointed elbows and knees, rotating shoulder guards, and helmets with visors and neck protection, all crafted to allow a surprising range of movement. Despite modern assumptions, a full suit of plate armor wasn't unbearably heavy or restrictive. On average, it weighed between 45 and 55 pounds, but that weight was spread out across the whole body and carefully balanced. A trained knight could walk, run, mount a horse, and fight without being significantly slowed down. Plate armor provided not only physical protection, but also a psychological edge. Appearing on the battlefield completely covered in polished steel had a strong visual impact, projecting strength and intimidation. It shifted the perception of power. Knights no longer just needed to be skilled, they also needed to look invulnerable. This transformation marked a turning point in medieval warfare, where appearance, defense, and technology all began working together to redefine what a warrior could be. Number 4, chainmail was still there, just not alone. Although plate armor eventually became the dominant form of protection for medieval knights, chainmail didn't vanish the moment solid steel became widespread. In reality, mail continued to play an important supporting role even during the height of plate armor's use. Full suits of plate were never completely seamless or entirely rigid. There were always vulnerable areas, places that needed to remain flexible to allow the knight to move properly, such as the armpits, elbows, back of the knees, groin, and neck. These zones couldn't be fully covered with hard plates without restricting movement too much or creating impractical gaps. That's where chainmail stayed useful. It filled in those spaces, acting as a flexible but still reliable barrier that could protect against slashes or glancing blows. Knights didn't abandon mail entirely, but rather adapted it into a secondary layer worn underneath or between plates. It served as a kind of safety net in case a weapon slipped through a joint or bypassed a main plate. This combination of solid protection and chainmail flexibility created one of the most effective